Vivian Ashworth had never been asked to fix a house before. Bridges, mills, the odd collapsing granary, those were the commissions that came to a woman architect who had clawed her way into a trade built entirely for men. But when the letter arrived from Winterspire Keep, sealed in black wax and written in a hand so sharp it seemed to cut the paper, she knew this commission was different before she had even read past the first line. Come at once. The heat is failing, and so, I fear, is everything else. The carriage climbed for the better part of 2 hours before the keep came into view, and when it did, Vivian understood why the coachman had refused to take her any closer than the outer gate. Winterspire did not sit upon its hill so much as loom over it, its grey stone walls streaked white with old frost that never seemed to melt, even in the thin autumn sun. Icicles hung from the eaves like teeth. Smoke, thin and grudging, rose from only one chimney out of what must have been 20. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the province had. Duke Thaddeus of Winterspire, the Ice Lord, they called him behind gloved hands and folded fans, a man who had not smiled since his father's death, who turned away every marriage prospect his aunt paraded before him, who was rumoured to keep his own house colder than the moors in January out of pure, unaccountable cruelty. Vivian did not believe half of what she heard. She had learned long ago that reputations were often built by people who had never bothered to knock on the door. She knocked now. The great oak door groaned open before her knuckles had finished their second rap, and a manservant with a face pinched by cold ushered her into a foyer so vast and so freezing that her breath clouded in front of her like a small ghost. "You are Miss Ashworth." The voice came from the shadow of the staircase before she had even set down her travelling case. He stepped into the grey light, and Vivienne understood at once why the villagers lowered their voices when they spoke of him. Duke Thaddeus was tall in the way that made door frames seem smaller, dressed in a black coat that had not been cut for warmth so much as severity, his dark hair pushed back from a face that might have been handsome if it had ever once relaxed. His eyes were the pale grey of river ice, and they moved over her with the swiftness of a man who had already decided she would fail him. "I am," she said, refusing to let the cold in the room or the cold in his stare put a tremor in her voice. "You wrote that the heating has failed." "I wrote that it is failing," he corrected. "There is a difference, and the difference is measured in days, not weeks. My steward tells me you repaired the flue works at Ashcombe Mill in a season when 3 master masons said it could not be done in a year. They were wrong about the season, not the work." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "Then perhaps you are the sort of person I require. Every architect and engineer I have summoned to this house in the past 2 years has left within a week, Miss Ashworth. Some left within a day." "Why?" "Because I do not explain myself, and because this house does not forgive those who cannot solve its problems quickly." He turned, his coat sweeping the stone floor, and began walking toward the corridor beyond the staircase without checking whether she followed. "The main heating channels run beneath the entire estate. Something within them has begun to fail, and if it is not found and mended, the failure will not stop at inconvenience. Do you understand me?" "I understand that you are frightened," Vivian said, before she could stop herself. He stopped walking. For one long moment, the only sound in the vast hall was the wind finding its way through some crack in the ancient stone. "I am concerned," he said at last, without turning around. "A duke does not have the luxury of fear." "Forgive me, I meant no offense." "You gave none?" He resumed walking, faster now, as though the exchange had cost him something he did not care to examine. "You will have 3 days to assess the extent of the damage before I expect a full account of what must be done. My staff will show you to the east wing, though I warn you it is the warmest room in the house, which is to say it is merely unbearable rather than lethal." Vivian followed him down the corridor, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to track her progress, past windows fogged thick with frost on the inside of the glass. She had expected arrogance from a duke. She had not expected the strange, brittle urgency beneath it, the sense that this man was not simply inconvenienced by a failing heating system, but genuinely, quietly afraid of what its failure might mean. "Your Grace," she said, when they reached the base of a narrow servant's stair that clearly led somewhere he had not intended to show a guest of her supposed rank. "If the channels run beneath the entire estate, might I ask where they lead? Every house I have worked on before had a simple purpose to its heat, to warm the rooms within it. Yours seems built for something else entirely." For the second time, he stopped, and for the second time, that flicker crossed his face. Not warmth exactly, but the shadow warmth might cast if it were ever allowed to exist in this house. "That," he said quietly, "is a question I am not yet prepared to answer. Rest tonight, Miss Ashworth. Tomorrow, I suspect, you will begin to find the answer yourself." He left her standing at the foot of the stairs, and somewhere far below, deep in the belly of the frozen house, Vivian thought she heard the low, distant groan of iron under pressure, like something enormous, straining to hold on just a little longer. Sleep did not come easily in the east wing. Vivian lay beneath 3 woolen blankets and a coverlet gone thin with age, listening to the house breathe around her. Not the ordinary creak of old timber settling, but something deeper, a rhythmic groaning that seemed to rise from beneath the very foundations. By the second hour past midnight, she gave up pretending she might rest and lit her candle instead. She had brought with her an old blueprint, copied by hand from the county archive before she left for Winterspire, showing the estate as it had been laid out generations ago. It was incomplete in places, the ink faded to little more than a suggestion, but one detail had caught her attention on the carriage ride up. A series of chambers beneath the main house marked simply as hearthworks, connected by a lattice of channels that spread not only through the keep itself, but far beyond its walls, down toward the valley. No ordinary manor needed heating channels that reached half a mile from its own foundations. Curiosity, and perhaps a professional's stubbornness, pulled her from her bed. She dressed quickly, wrapped a shawl twice around her shoulders, and took the servant's stair Thaddeus had shown her that afternoon, candle in hand, blueprint tucked beneath her arm. The stairway spiraled down far longer than she had expected, the stone walls growing damp and then, strangely, warmer the further she descended. By the time she reached the bottom, her candle was barely necessary. A dull orange glow filled the passage ahead, and with it came heat. Real heat. The first she had felt since arriving at Winterspire, thick and close and smelling faintly of scorched iron and coal. She followed the glow through a low archway and stopped. The chamber before her was enormous, hewn from the living rock beneath the keep, and dominated by a row of great copper boilers, their riveted seams glowing dull red where the fires beneath them roared. Pipes as thick as a man's waist ran from the boilers in every direction, disappearing into the walls and the floor, some rising up toward the house above, others sinking down and away, deeper still, toward a direction Vivian understood, with a strange lurch in her chest, must lead toward the valley. And there, stripped of his black coat, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and his waistcoat unbuttoned against the furnace heat, stood Duke Thaddeus. He had not heard her arrive. He was entirely absorbed in the work before him, one gloved hand turning a great iron valve wheel, while the other adjusted a lever that fed coal into the nearest firebox. His movements practiced and sure in a way that spoke of long, solitary hours spent doing precisely this. Sweat traced a line down his temple. His face, lit orange by the furnace glow, had none of the guarded coldness she had seen in the foyer. It was tired. Genuinely, deeply tired. The way a man looks when a burden has been carried so long he has forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Vivienne must have made some small sound, because he turned sharply, and the tiredness vanished behind the mask so quickly she might have imagined it entirely. "You should not be here." His voice was low, urgent in a way she had not heard from him before. "I heard the house groaning. I could not sleep for it." She stepped further into the chamber, her eyes moving over the great tangle of pipework. "Your Grace, these channels, they do not run only through the house. I saw the direction of that largest line. It runs down the mountain." He said nothing. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might simply order her back up the stairs and be done with it. "It runs to Oakhaven Valley," she said, when he did not deny it. "You are heating the entire town." "I am heating what needs to be heated." He turned back to the valve wheel, though his hands had gone still upon it. "The town below has no coal seams of its own worth the digging. Their winters were finishing them long before I inherited this house. The old, the very young, whole families lost to a single hard frost. My grandfather built these works 3 generations ago as a private indulgence, warming only his own halls. My father expanded them, foolishly, recklessly, until half the province depended on Winterspire's fires and the estate's coffers could no longer bear the cost of running them and heating the house besides." "So you chose the town over your own comfort?" "I chose the town over my own house, burning through what little coin remains before I have found a way to make the mines here pay for themselves properly." He said it flatly, as though reciting a ledger rather than a sacrifice. "It is a temporary arrangement. It has simply been temporary for longer than I intended." Vivian looked at him, at the frost that lived permanently in his windows, at the shirt damp with honest labor, at a duke who spent his nights alone in a stone cellar, shoveling coal so that people who did not even know his name might sleep warm in their beds. "Nobody in that valley knows, do they?" she said quietly. It was not truly a question. "Nobody needs to know." His eyes met hers, and there was something almost pleading beneath the sternness of it. "I did not bring you here to write ballads about my generosity, Miss Ashworth. I brought you here because the 3rd boiler has begun to fail, and if it fails entirely, there will be no heat for this house or that valley, and I will not be able to fix it with my own 2 hands as I have managed thus far." "Then let me help you," she said, setting down her candle. "Properly, not merely surveying by daylight while you exhaust yourself by night." He studied her for a long moment, the furnace light flickering across a face that seemed, for the first time since she had arrived, uncertain rather than commanding. "Very well," he said at last, "but you will keep what you have seen tonight to yourself. That is the only condition I set." Vivienne nodded, already reaching for the blueprint tucked beneath her arm, already tracing with one finger the long, hidden line that ran from the heart of Winterspire Keep all the way down to a town that owed its warmth to a man it believed had none. 2 days passed in the hearth-room before Vivienne saw daylight properly again. She had spent them tracing pipework through cellars she was fairly certain no living soul but Thaddeus had walked in years, marking corrosion here, a hairline crack there, filling 3 pages of her notebook with measurements and questions she did not yet have answers for. By the 3rd morning, her supply of drafting chalk had run out entirely, along with the particular grade of jointing clay she needed to test a theory about the failing 3rd boiler. Neither could be found within the Keep's own stores. The market at Oakhaven Valley, the housekeeper, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Pruitt, told her over a hurried breakfast. "Held every 3rd day. You'll find your masonry supplies there, miss, though I'd wrap up well. It's a fair walk down, even with the pony cart." Vivian welcomed the excuse to leave the Keep's endless grey stone for an hour or 2. She dressed in her warmest travelling coat, certain the valley would be as bitterly cold as the mountain above it, and was surprised, as the cart rounded the last bend of the descending road, to find the air growing steadily milder rather than harsher. By the time she reached the village square, she had unbuttoned her coat entirely. Oakhaven Valley was smaller than she had expected, a cluster of stone cottages and timbered shop fronts arranged around a market square, bright with striped awnings and the calls of tradesmen. An old man sat outside the cooper's shop with his coat open, whittling contentedly in what should have been, by every reasonable measure, a bitter autumn morning. Vivienne felt the strangeness of it settle over her slowly, like a puzzle piece easing into place. "You'll be the architect up at the Keep?" The woman at the masonry stall did not wait to be asked, sizing Vivienne up with the frank curiosity of someone who had clearly heard news of her arrival within hours of the carriage passing through. "Word travels quick in a valley this small." "I am Vivian Ashworth." She began selecting jointing clay from the woman's stock, testing its pliability between gloved fingers. "You keep remarkably warm down here for the season." "Aye, we do that. Always have, long as I can remember, and my mother before me said the same. The stall-holder wrapped a block of clay in waxed paper. There's warmth that comes up through the ground itself, miss, if you'll believe it. Runs beneath half the cottages in the square. My grandfather used to say the old Duke's family built it for us, generations back, though nobody rightly knows the truth of it now. The stones under the floor stay warm as a hearth, winter through, and never once gone cold in my lifetime. And you have never wondered at the cost of such a thing? The woman laughed, not unkindly.
Cost to whom? It comes from the mountain and asks nothing of us. Vivienne paid for her supplies and walked on through the square, listening more carefully now to the easy chatter around her. An elderly woman sat on a bench in the thin sun, her shawl loose about her shoulders rather than clutched tight. Two men repaired a cartwheel with their sleeves rolled up, as though it were early autumn rather than the deep cold season. Everywhere she looked, she saw a village that had made its peace with warmth so complete it no longer thought to be grateful for it. And not one soul among them spoke the name of Duke Thaddeus with anything but the same wary, dismissive scorn she had heard before she ever arrived at Winterspire. The Ice Lord, an old farmer muttered near the well, when another man asked idly after the state of the roads up toward the keep. Colder than his own chimneys, that one. Never comes down among decent folk. Wouldn't know his own tenants if they stood before him. And yet you're warm as a summer's day standing here complaining of him, Vivienne said, before she could stop herself. The farmer blinked at her, startled by the interruption. That's the mountain's doing, miss, not his. She did not correct him. She had promised Thaddeus her silence, and a promise made in a firelit cellar at midnight felt, to her, no less binding than one made before a magistrate. But the injustice of it sat uneasily in her chest as she loaded her purchases into the pony cart and began the climb back toward the keep. She thought of the frost thick on his windows, the threadbare state of the coat he wore indoors, the way Mrs. Pruitt had apologized for the thinness of the breakfast gruel, as though such economies were simply the ordinary shape of life at Winterspire. He was starving his own house of warmth and comfort, she realized, quite deliberately, so that strangers who scorned his name might never once shiver through a winter's night. And he wanted no thanks for it. He wanted, it seemed, not even to be understood. The cart climbed higher, the mild valley air giving way once more to the biting chill of the mountain road, and Vivienne pulled her coat closed again, though it was not entirely the cold that had settled into her now. It was something closer to anger, not at Thaddeus, but at a world so quick to call a man cruel simply because he had never once explained the true cost of his kindness. By the time Winterspire's grey towers came into view above the tree line, she had already begun to wonder how she might convince him that some burdens were not meant to be carried entirely alone. The library at Winterspire occupied the whole of the west tower, 3 stories of shelving climbing toward a domed ceiling painted long ago with constellations that had faded to a dull grey blue, like the sky itself had grown tired of shining. Vivienne had asked Mrs. Pruitt for access to the estate's old structural plans, hoping to find some record of when the 3rd boiler had last been properly overhauled, and had been given, in return, a great iron key and a warning that no one but the Duke himself had set foot in that room for the better part of a year. She spent the better part of an afternoon there, dust rising in slow columns through the light from the tall windows, working her way through drawers of yellowed drawings until she found what she had come for. A ledger, bound in cracked leather, recording every repair made to the hearthworks across 3 generations. It was in reading through the entries that she noticed the gap. The ledger ran in careful, unbroken order from the time of Thaddeus's grandfather until roughly 9 years past, and then, quite suddenly, a dozen pages had been removed. Not torn carelessly, but cut close to the binding with something sharp and deliberate, leaving only the barest fringe of paper behind. Whatever had been recorded there, someone had wanted it gone entirely. She was still turning the ledger over in her hands, trying to make sense of the missing years, when the library door opened behind her. "You work later than any architect I have employed before you." Thaddeus stood in the doorway, a single lantern in his hand,
his coat unbuttoned as though he had not expected to find anyone still awake at this hour. It was well past midnight. She had lost track of the time entirely. "I found something odd," she said, and held up the ledger. "Pages missing. Cut, not torn. 9 years back, near as I can tell." Something crossed his face, not quite alarm, but a wariness that told her she had found precisely the thing he had not wished her to find. He set the lantern down on the reading table and crossed the room slowly, as though each step were a decision made and remade. "May I?" He held out his hand for the ledger, and she gave it to him. He turned to the cut pages, ran his thumb along the ragged edge of paper still clinging to the binding, and was silent long enough that Vivienne began to wonder if he meant to answer her at all. "My father cut those pages himself," he said at last. "I found him doing it, the winter before he died. I did not understand why, not then." "And now?" He set the ledger down and lowered himself into the chair opposite her, the lantern light carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. "My father was not a careful man, Miss Ashworth. He loved this estate the way some men love a wager, recklessly, and without any true understanding of what it might cost him. He expanded the hearthworks to cover the whole of Oakhaven Valley within a single decade, borrowing heavily against the estate to do it, certain that the coal seams beneath the mountain would prove rich enough to repay every debt twice over. And they did not. They did not. His voice had gone quiet, stripped of the coldness she had grown used to. By the time he died, Winterspire owed more than its rents could recover in a generation. He cut those pages, I believe, because they recorded every loan, every mortgage against the land, every promise made to men in Ironstone who would have seen this house sold to the highest bidder the moment they learned how deep the debt truly ran. He could not bear for it to be known. Not even by me. Vivienne thought of the frost on his windows, the thinness of his coat, the gruel Mrs. Pruitt had apologized for. "You have been repaying it yourself, all this time." There was no one else to do it. He said it simply, without any bid for sympathy, the way a man states the weather. "I inherited a title, an estate, and a debt large enough to swallow both, and a valley full of people who would freeze without the very system that had ruined us financially to build. I could not tear it down to save myself. I could only starve the house instead, year upon year, until the debt was small enough to bear." "How much longer?" 2 years, perhaps 3 if the coal prices hold." He looked at her then, and there was something raw in his expression that she had not seen even in the hearth room, something he had perhaps never shown to another living soul within these walls. "I do not tell you this for pity, Miss Ashworth. I tell you because you have a right to understand precisely what is at stake should that third boiler fail entirely. It is not merely comfort I stand to lose, it is the last chance I have to see this house restored to something other than ruin, and the valley kept warm besides. You have carried this entirely alone." It was not a question, but she found she needed to say it aloud regardless. "I did not think there was another way to carry it." For a moment, his composure slipped further than she had ever seen it slip, something almost boyish and lost passing behind his pale eyes before the mask settled once more into place. "You are the first person I have told the whole of it to. My aunt suspects economy. My steward suspects debt. No one suspects the truth entire, and I confess I had grown accustomed to believing no one ever would." Vivienne reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that the gesture could not be mistaken. "Then let it be carried by 2, Your Grace, at least until the boiler is mended, and the debt has shrunk enough to loosen its grip on you." He looked down at the small distance between their hands upon the worn leather ledger, and for the first time since her arrival at Winterspire Keep, Duke Thaddeus did not look away from her at all. 3 days after the night in the library, the weather turned in earnest, and with it came the task Vivienne had been dreading since she first traced the pipework on her borrowed blueprint. The intake flues that fed cold air into the hearthworks lay not within the keep itself, but high above it, along a narrow shelf of rock the estate workers called Crag Pass, a wind-scoured ridge where the mountain fell away sharply on one side into a grey, indifferent valley far below. "You need not come," Thaddeus told her that morning, as the stable hands saddled two sturdy ponies suited to the climb. "I have made this inspection alone every season for the better part of 9 years. And every season you have had no one to hold the second lantern or steady the second rope should the wind decide to test you." Vivienne pulled her riding gloves tight and swung up into the saddle before he could argue further. "I did not travel all this way to sit by a fire while the actual work happens without me, Your Grace." He did not argue again, though she caught, just before he turned his pony toward the mountain track, the faint suggestion of something that might have been relief. The climb took the better part of 2 hours, the path narrowing steadily until the ponies could go no further, and the last stretch had to be made on foot, boots finding purchase on rock, worn smooth by generations of estate workers who had walked this same route before them. By the time they reached the flues, a row of iron grates set into the mountainside, drawing air down into the network of channels below, the wind had picked up considerably, tugging at Vivienne's skirts and whistling through the narrow pass with a sound like something half alive. "The third flue," Thaddeus said, crouching beside the nearest grate, raising his voice above the wind. "It draws unevenly. I believe ice has built along the inner shaft, narrowing the passage. If it closes entirely, the boiler beneath loses half its draft, and—" He did not finish the thought. He did not need to. Vivienne had spent enough nights now in the hearthroom to understand precisely what a starved boiler meant for the pressure building in the lines beneath it. She knelt beside him, unpacking the small set of tools she had carried up strapped to her back, and together they worked at clearing the grate, chipping away at rime that had crept far deeper into the shaft than either of them had expected. The wind grew worse as they worked, gusting hard enough that Vivienne had to brace herself against the rock more than once, her fingers growing numb despite her gloves. It was on the fourth such gust, sudden and vicious, tearing across the exposed ridge without warning, that the trouble truly began. It caught her satchel of tools and sent it skidding toward the drop, and Vivienne, without thinking, lunged after it. "Vivienne!" She had never heard him say her given name before. It struck her almost as forcefully as the wind did, and in the half-second of surprise it cost her, her footing slipped on the icy rock. He caught her before she had gone more than a stride toward the edge, one arm hard around her waist, hauling her back against the mountainside with a strength that left her breathless in a way the climb alone had not managed. The satchel was lost to the valley below, tumbling out of sight, but neither of them so much as glanced after it. "You might have gone over," he said, and his voice, close to her ear, was rougher than she had ever heard it, stripped entirely of the cold formality he wore like armor in the halls of his own house. "I was thinking of the tools, not the drop." "Then you were thinking foolishly." But there was no true anger in it, only something that sounded, beneath the roughness, remarkably like fear. The wind had not eased. If anything, it grew sharper, and before she could protest, he had shrugged out of his heavy coat and settled it around her shoulders in addition to her own, angling his own body between her and the worst of the gusts. One arm still braced firmly at her back, as though he did not entirely trust the mountain not to try for her a second time. "You will freeze," she said, though the coat was already warm from him, and she found she did not much want to give it back. "I have spent 9 winters freezing by choice, Miss Ashworth. A few minutes more will not undo me." His pale eyes, so often distant and unreadable, were fixed on her now with an intensity that had nothing at all to do with the failing flue beside them. "I confess I did not consider until this moment how very much I did not wish to lose you off the side of a mountain." "I am not so easily lost." "No." Something eased in his face, not quite a smile, but its nearest cousin. "I am beginning to understand that about you." They finished clearing the flue together, working more carefully now, her shoulder brushing his more than once in the cramped space beside the grate, neither of them commenting on it. The ice gave way at last, the shaft opening cleanly, and Thaddeus held his palm above it to feel the draft rush through, strong and steady, exactly as it should be. "That is one flue mended," he said, rising and offering her his hand to help her up from the crouch.
6 more remain along this ridge, and the wind shows no sign of relenting. Then we had best not waste the daylight arguing about whose coat is whose. She handed it back to him, though reluctantly, and caught, in the brief moment their hands met over the worn wool, an expression on his face she suspected he had not intended her to see. Something unguarded. Something that looked a great deal like a man who had spent 9 years convincing himself he required no one, beginning, quite against his will, to doubt it. They worked the remaining flues in near silence, but it was not the silence of strangers laboring at a shared task. It was something closer, unspoken and new, and it followed them all the way back down the mountain as the light began to fail behind them. The northern wing of Winterspire had been sealed for as long as anyone in the household could remember. Mrs. Pruitt called it the old nursery wing, though she could not say with any certainty who had last used the nurseries within it, and when Vivian asked Thaddeus for the key to its lower conduits, he had given it to her with the same wariness he had shown outside the hearthroom on her first night. "There is little reason for you to go there," he had said. "The pipework beneath the north wing feeds only a portion of the valley's easternmost cottages. It has given no trouble in years." "Which is precisely why I should look at it," Vivian had answered. "A boiler that never gives trouble is a boiler no one has inspected properly in longer than they ought to admit." She went alone that morning, candle and tools in hand, down a servant's stair colder and narrower than any she had yet used at the keep, into a stretch of conduit tunnels that had clearly not seen a lantern's light in a great many seasons. Dust lay thick along the pipe casings, undisturbed, and cobwebs stretched between the support beams like fine grey lace. It took her the better part of an hour to find it, working her way along the main eastern line by the light of her single candle, tapping the copper casing every few feet the way Thaddeus had taught her, listening for the change in tone that meant trouble beneath the surface. She found it at last where the line bent sharply beneath the old nursery floor, a section of pipe swollen and discoloured, the copper gone a sickly greenish-white where mineral deposits had built up thick along the inner wall. She chipped away a small section with her awl, and what came loose made her breath catch. The deposit was not a thin scale, the sort that gathered slowly and honestly over years of hard water passing through iron. It was thick, layered, built up in a way that told her this particular stretch of pipe had been failing steadily for a very long time indeed, likely since long before she had ever arrived at Winterspire. She followed the blockage further, and the deeper she went, the worse it grew, until she reached the great joint where the eastern line met the main trunk feeding both the house above and the valley below. There, the mineral buildup had narrowed the passage so severely that only a thread of steam could be forcing its way through at all. The pressure behind it, she realized with a cold lurch entirely unrelated to the temperature of the tunnel, had nowhere left to go but back along the line, building steadily against joints and seams never designed to bear it. If that joint failed, and by the state of the corrosion around it, it was not a question of if so much as when. The pressure would tear backward through the entire eastern network in a matter of moments. Every pipe from the nursery wing down to the valley cottages would rupture in sequence, and the main trunk feeding the whole of Winterspire's heat would very likely go with it. She found Thaddeus in the library that evening, and the look on her face must have told him something before she had even spoken, because he rose from his chair at once. "How bad?" he asked. "Days, Your Grace. Perhaps a week if we are fortunate, though I would not wager the valley's safety on fortune alone." She spread her notes across the table, the sketch of the corroded joint stark against the pale paper. "The entire eastern trunk must be replaced, not merely repaired. Every length of pipe from the nursery wing to the point where it meets the main line beneath the house. If that joint fails while the boilers are at full pressure, it will not fail quietly." He studied the sketch for a long moment, his jaw set in the way she had come to recognize as the shape his fear took when he would not permit himself to name it plainly. What would such a failure mean, in terms I might explain to my steward without causing outright panic? In terms you might explain to your steward, it would mean no heat for the valley in the dead of winter and considerable damage to this house besides. She hesitated, then chose honesty over gentleness, judging rightly that he would prefer it.
In truth, Your Grace, a rupture of that scale, so close to the main trunk, could bring down a section of the nursery floor above it. The tunnels there are old. I do not believe the stonework was built to withstand a burst of that pressure. Then it is not merely the heat at risk. His voice had gone very quiet. No, it is the house itself, in that one wing at least, and very possibly whoever happened to be standing above it when the pipe finally gave way. He was silent for a long moment, staring down at her sketch as though he might, by sheer will, find some flaw in her reasoning that would make the danger smaller than it was. She let him have the silence. She had learned in her weeks at Winterspire that he needed it, needed the space to absorb bad news privately before he could act upon it decisively, the way a man braces himself before lifting a weight he already knows will strain him. "What do you require," he said at last, "to replace the entire eastern trunk before that joint fails?" "Cast iron valves of a particular bore, more than the estate keeps in store, skilled hands beyond your own household staff, stonemasons at the very least, to shore up the tunnel where we must dig new channels for the replaced line. And time we may not entirely have. Then we shall have to find all three regardless." He straightened, and something settled into his expression that she recognized now as the particular resolve he wore when a problem had become, in his mind, simply another burden to be carried rather than feared. The Ironstone Guild district holds men and materials enough for such work, if they can be persuaded to travel this far into the mountains on short notice. "And will they be persuaded, Your Grace? I understand your reputation there is not entirely warm?" A ghost of dry humor crossed his face, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "No, it is not. But you have already proven yourself rather better at persuading strangers of my good intentions than I have ever managed myself, Miss Ashworth. Perhaps it is time you tried your hand at it again." The coach ride to Ironstone took the better part of a day, winding down out of the mountains and along a wide river valley thick with smoke from 100 forges. Vivian had never seen the Guild City before, though she had heard of it often enough in professional circles. A place where every trade connected to stone and iron kept its hall, where reputations were made and broken over the quality of a single casting. She had also heard, more than once during her career, the particular scorn with which the guildmasters spoke of Winterspire's owner. The guild hall itself was an imposing building of blackened brick, its great hall lined with the banners of a dozen separate trades. Vivian was kept waiting nearly an hour before she was admitted to the chamber where the ironworkers' masters conducted their business, and the reception she received once inside did little to improve her mood. Winterspire. The eldest of the three masters, a broad man named Halvard, with soot permanently worked into the creases of his hands, said the word the way one might name an unpaid debt. "We have not sent men or materials to that estate in near a decade, Miss Ashworth, and I confess I see little reason to begin again now. The Duke requires cast iron valves of a particular bore, and stonemasons besides, within the fortnight. The matter concerns the safety of both his household and the valley below it." "The matter concerns the Duke's purse, more like." The second master, younger and sharper-tongued, did not bother hiding his contempt. "We have heard the tales same as anyone. A man who keeps his own house colder than a tomb, who has not so much as set foot in this city in years, who dismissed every architect and engineer sent to him before you with nothing but insults for their trouble. Forgive me if I do not rush to fill his order on credit." Vivian felt the familiar heat of frustration rising in her chest, the same injustice she had swallowed down in the Oakhaven market weeks before. But she had promised Thaddeus her silence on the true nature of his sacrifice, and a promise given in a firelit cellar still bound her, however much it chafed against her now. "You are wrong about him," she said instead, choosing her words with care. "I have worked in his house for some weeks now, gentlemen, closer to the man than any of you have troubled yourselves to come. He is not cruel, he is careful and guarded, and yes, difficult besides, but I have seen him labor through the night beside his own servants to keep his tenants safe from a danger none of them even know exists. Whatever coldness you have heard tell of, I promise you it is not the coldness of a man who does not care." Halvard studied her for a long moment, his heavy brow drawn low. "You speak with a great deal of conviction. For an architect he has employed but a few weeks. I speak with conviction because I have seen it with my own eyes, and because a great many innocent people will suffer if you allow old grudges to outweigh good sense. I am not asking you to forgive whatever offense he has given your guild in years past. I am asking you to sell him valves and lend him masons at a fair price, paid promptly, because the alternative is a burst pipeline that may well collapse part of his own house and leave an entire valley without heat come the first hard frost. The younger master opened his mouth to argue further, but Halvard raised a hand, silencing him. "You are not the first to defend that man to me, Miss Ashworth," he said slowly. "But you are the first I have believed. My own father did business with the old Duke, Thaddeus's grandfather, and swore the family was an honest one once, whatever has become of the son since." He rubbed a thumb along the edge of the table, considering. "I will sell the valves at fair price, and I will send 2 masons, good men, capable of digging new channels through old stone quickly and without complaint. But I want it understood, Miss Ashworth, this is done on your word, not his reputation. Should it prove false, the debt of trust falls upon you, not upon Winterspire." "I accept those terms gladly." It took the better part of the afternoon to settle the particulars, the bore and quantity of valves required, the wages for the masons, the schedule by which materials might be transported up the mountain road before the weather closed it entirely. By the time Vivian left the Guildhall, dusk had settled thick over Ironstone, the forge smoke turning the sky a deep, bruised orange. She found, waiting outside in the yard, an unexpected sight. Thaddeus himself, having ridden down separately to oversee the transport arrangements, standing beside the loaded cart with an expression she could not quite read. "You did not need to come yourself," she said. "I did not trust the negotiation to go smoothly without difficulty, and I did not wish you to bear the weight of Ironstone's opinion of me entirely alone." He glanced toward the Guildhall doors, then back to her. "Halvard's second son once told me to my face that I was not fit to hold my father's title. I did not think it wise to test whether the old grudge had softened. It has, somewhat, though I confess I did not tell them the whole truth of why you deserve better opinions than they hold." She met his eyes. "I told them only that I have seen enough of you to believe the tales were wrong, without saying precisely how I came to know it." Something in his expression eased, gratitude and something warmer besides, moving briefly across features that had grown steadily less guarded with every week she had spent at Winterspire. "You did not need to defend me at all, Miss Ashworth, and yet you did so regardless." "I find myself doing a great many things lately that I did not strictly need to do," she said, and did not look away from him as she said it, and for once, neither did he look away from her. The masons and materials arrived from Ironstone 4 days later, and for a week the eastern trunk work proceeded steadily, section by section, the old corroded pipe drawn out and replaced with new cast iron, while Vivian and Thaddeus alternated between overseeing the diggers and inspecting each completed joint themselves. It was slow, careful work, and by the 8th day they had cleared nearly 2/3 of the failing line. It was not enough. The frost came early that year, and it came hard. Mrs. Pruitt had warned of it at supper, her weathered face drawn with the particular certainty of a woman who had lived her whole life reading the sky, and by nightfall the warning had proven true beyond anything Vivian had imagined. The wind screamed against the keep's stone walls with a violence that rattled every window in its frame, and the temperature dropped so sharply that the water left standing in the wash basin in her room had frozen solid within the hour. She was still dressing, pulling her warmest coat over 3 layers of wool, when the household bell began ringing below. Not the ordinary summons for supper or prayers, but a frantic, uneven clanging that could mean only one thing. She found Thaddeus already halfway down the servants' stair, lantern in hand, his face set in the particular grim calm she had come to recognize as the shape his fear took when there was no more time left for it. "The main trunk," he said, not slowing his pace. "The section we have not yet replaced. The pressure gauge in the hearth room has climbed higher than I have ever seen it." They reached the boiler chamber to find 2 of the household men already there, one of them ankle-deep in freezing water, where a lesser joint further along had already begun to weep under the strain, the other struggling with a valve wheel that would not turn. The cold outside had thickened the steam within the pipes faster than it could pass, and the old, unreplaced section of the eastern line, the very stretch Vivienne had marked as most dangerous, the joint nearest the nursery wing above, groaned with a sound like something enormous in pain. If that joint fails now, at full pressure, in this cold— Vivienne did not finish the thought. She did not need to. Then it will not fail. Thaddeus was already shrugging out of his coat, rolling his sleeves as he had that first night she found him here, reaching for the heavy iron wrench hung beside the nearest valve. "Tell me what must be done, Miss Ashworth, and I will do it. There is no time to send for more men." They worked through the night entirely alone but for the 2 household staff, moving from valve to valve along the length of the failing trunk, easing pressure where they could, hammering free ice that had formed at 3 separate junctions where the bitter cold had crept in through cracks in the old stonework. Vivienne's hands, even gloved, went numb within the first hour, and still she worked, guiding Thaddeus through each release valve by memory of the blueprint she had studied so many nights before, calling out measurements and warnings over the roar of steam and wind both. Twice the pressure surged high enough that steam hissed loudly through a seam that had not yet given way, and twice Thaddeus threw his weight against a valve wheel that fought him with the stubbornness of rusted iron, forcing it closed a fraction more before the joint behind it could rupture entirely. Water pooled cold and black across the stone floor, soaking through both their boots, and neither of them stopped to notice. It was well past 3 in the morning when the worst of it finally eased. The pressure gauge Vivienne had been watching all night creeping back down from its dangerous height, the groaning in the old pipe fading to something almost gentle, almost safe. She sat back heavily against the nearest wall, her whole body trembling with cold and exhaustion both, and found Thaddeus sinking down beside her a moment later, his shirt soaked through, his hands raw and blistered from the wrench. "We held it," he said, his voice hoarse, disbelieving, as though he had not quite allowed himself to hope for it until the words left his mouth. "We held it," she agreed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The furnace fires burned low and steady before them, the only warmth in a chamber that had, hours before, felt like the very edge of disaster. Vivienne looked at him in that dim orange light, his composure entirely stripped away, his hair damp with sweat and melted frost, his hands trembling faintly where they rested against his knees, and thought that she had never, in all her years of travelling from one commission to the next, seen a man work so hard, so entirely without complaint, to protect people who did not even know his name. "You should not have had to do this alone tonight," she said quietly, "nor any night before it." "I did not do it alone tonight." He turned his head toward her, and whatever remained of the Ice Lord's mask had gone entirely from his face, leaving something far more honest behind it. "I have thought a great deal these past weeks about how very long I convinced myself that this house required a man who needed no one at all. I begin to suspect I was wrong in that, Miss Ashworth. I begin to suspect I have been wrong in it for rather longer than I care to admit." Vivienne said nothing to that, only reached across the small distance between them and let her hand rest, cold and steady against his own. Outside, the frost howled on against the keep's ancient walls, but within the hearth-room, for the first time since her arrival at Winterspire, the cold did not seem to reach quite so far. The great frost broke after 3 days, giving way to a cold but steady calm that allowed the eastern trunk work to resume in earnest. With the danger of the previous week still fresh in both their minds, Thaddeus insisted the remaining custom pipework be fashioned close at hand, rather than waiting on further deliveries from Ironstone, and so the old carriage house, long emptied of its coaches and given over to dust and cobwebs, was turned within a day into a makeshift workshop. Vivienne had grown fond of the space almost immediately. Unlike the rest of Winterspire, it did not carry the weight of the estate's long history upon it. No portraits watching from the walls, no faded ledgers hinting at old debts. It was simply a wide, draughty building filled with the honest clutter of tools and half-finished ironwork, sunlight slanting in thin bars through gaps in the shuttered windows. She had taken to spending her afternoons there, shaping the last of the custom joints herself, working alongside the two masons from Ironstone and, more often than either of them expected, alongside Thaddeus, who had developed in recent weeks an interest in the mechanics of the work that went well beyond what strict necessity required. It was on a grey afternoon, some 20 days into her stay, that the accident happened. She had been fitting a length of pipe against the forge-heated edge of a newly cast joint, testing the seam for any weakness before it was set permanently in place, when the metal shifted unexpectedly beneath her grip. The sharp, burred edge caught the side of her palm before she could pull free, opening a shallow but stinging cut across the base of her thumb. "Miss Ashworth," one of the masons started forward, but Thaddeus was faster, closing the distance from the far side of the workshop in a handful of strides, his own tools abandoned mid-task.
"Let me see." He took her hand before she had properly gathered her wits to protest, turning it gently toward the light from the nearest window. The cut was not deep, but it bled freely, and his expression, usually so carefully composed, tightened with a concern that seemed, to Vivian's mind, rather greater than the injury strictly warranted. "It is nothing, Your Grace. A scratch. I have had worse from a stubborn hinge." "You will allow me to judge that for myself." His voice held none of the sharpness she might have expected from a man accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving argument. He guided her toward a bench near the workshop's small stove, calling for water and clean linen from the household girl who had been assisting with the day's work, and knelt beside her with an attentiveness that struck her as entirely unlike the Ice Lord of Oakhaven's tales. He cleaned the wound himself, his touch far gentler than the size of his hands might have suggested, wrapping the linen with a care that spoke of practice she had not expected him to possess. "You have done this before," she said, watching his hands work. "More often than I would like to admit." He did not look up from the bandage. "There were years, when I was first learning the hearthworks alone, when I burned or cut myself with some regularity. There was no one to tend such wounds but myself, and I confess I grew rather skilled at it out of simple necessity." "No one at all?" His hands stilled briefly over the linen. "My father was not the sort of man to trouble himself with small injuries, Miss Ashworth, and my mother did not live long enough to trouble herself with much of anything concerning me at all. I learned early that a duke's son does not weep over a cut hand, and later that a duke does not either. One simply tends to it and continues the work." There was no self-pity in the way he said it, only the flat, worn honesty of a man reciting a fact so long accepted he no longer thought to soften it. Vivian felt something tighten in her chest, some tenderness she had been trying, for several weeks now, not to examine too closely. "That seems a lonely way to have grown up," she said quietly. It was. He finished the bandage, securing it with a small, neat knot, and for a moment did not release her hand entirely, his thumb resting lightly against her wrist, as though he had not yet decided to let the moment end. "I had grown rather accustomed to it, in truth, until recently. I did not think there was any particular remedy for it, nor did I much look for one." "And now?" He looked up at her then, and the guarded distance she had first met in the keep's frozen foyer seemed, in that moment, entirely absent from his face. "Now I find myself considerably less certain that loneliness was ever the inevitable condition I once believed it to be." Neither of them spoke for a long moment after that, the workshop quiet but for the crackle of the small stove and the distant ring of the masons' hammers resuming their work on the far side of the room. Vivian did not pull her hand away, and Thaddeus did not release it, and something passed between them in that stillness that neither of them yet had the words to name properly, though both, she suspected, understood its shape well enough. "We ought to finish the joint before the light fails," she said at last, though she made no particular haste to move. "Indeed we ought." He rose, offering his hand to help her from the bench, and if he held it a moment longer than the task strictly required, neither of them remarked upon it, and the workshop's grey afternoon light seemed, for a little while at least, considerably warmer than the season had any right to allow. 5 days after the injury in the carriage house, the last length of the eastern trunk was set into place. Vivian stood beside the final joint in the boiler chamber, her bandaged hand steady now,
watching the two masons from Ironstone tighten the final bolts, while Thaddeus checked each seam in turn with the same careful attention he gave every part of the work that mattered to him. "That is the whole of it," one of the masons said, straightening at last, wiping soot from his hands onto a rag. "Every length replaced, every joint sound, from the nursery wing clean through to the main trunk. Whatever pressure this winter throws at it, it will hold." "Then we test it properly," Thaddeus said, and Vivian heard, beneath the steadiness of his voice, something that had not been there in all the weeks she had known him. A thin, careful thread of hope, the kind a man allows himself only once he has stopped believing disappointment is the more likely outcome. They fired the boilers together that evening, all three at once for the first time since Vivian's arrival, feeding coal steadily into each firebox while the pressure gauges climbed slow and even, none of the alarming jumps or hesitations that had plagued the old, corroded line. The masons stayed to watch the first hour, then departed for the guest quarters Mrs. Pruitt had prepared for them, leaving Vivian and Thaddeus alone in the chamber to see the work through to its true test. It came gradually, not all at once, as Vivian had somehow expected after so many weeks of urgency and danger. The stone of the chamber itself began to warm first, then the corridor beyond it, and by the time they climbed the servants' stair together to check the rooms above, the change had already reached the ground floor of the keep. The chill that had greeted Vivian on her very first evening at Winterspire, that had lived in every corridor and every draughty window since, had begun, quietly and without ceremony, to lift. They walked the length of the house together, checking each room in turn, and Vivian watched something shift in Thaddeus's expression with every doorway they passed. The library, where frost no longer crept along the inside of the glass. The great hall, where the vast hearth, long unused, had begun for the first time in years to draw heat properly through its flue. The foyer itself, where she had first met him, now merely cool rather than bitter. "I had forgotten," he said quietly, standing in the middle of that foyer with one hand resting against the stone wall as though testing it were real. What this house felt like when it was not simply enduring. "I do not think I have stood in this room without my coat properly fastened in 9 years. "Then perhaps it is time you grew accustomed to it again." They rode down to Oakhaven Valley themselves 2 mornings later, once the network had held steady long enough to trust it, to confirm what the pressure gauges already promised, that the valley below had lost nothing in the transition, that every cottage along the eastern channel drew its share of warmth exactly as it always had, only now from pipework sound enough to see them through a dozen winters rather than merely one more uncertain season. Vivian watched Thaddeus stand at the edge of the market square, unnoticed among the ordinary bustle of a village morning, and understood that he had likely never once stood there simply to observe the fruits of his own sacrifice before. It was that evening, back in the warmth of the library, that he finally said the things she suspected he had been circling for days. "I have spent 9 years believing that no one could understand what this house required of me," he said, seated across from her at the same table where he had first shown her the cut pages of the old ledger. "Not my aunt, who believes me merely eccentric. Not my steward, who believes me merely frugal. I did not think it possible for anyone to see the whole of it and not think me either a fool for the sacrifice or a coward for hiding it. And now? Now I find I was wrong on every count." He reached across the table, and this time there was no hesitation in the gesture at all, his hand settling over hers with a certainty she had watched him build slowly, piece by piece, across every shared danger of the past weeks. "You are the first person, Miss Ashworth, who has looked at the whole of what I have carried and understood it, rather than merely pitying it, or dismissing it, or fearing it. I do not know that I have properly thanked you for that." "You do not need to thank me for understanding you, Your Grace. I did nothing more than pay attention." "You did a great deal more than that, and we both know it." His thumb traced, briefly, absently, along the edge of her still healing hand. "I have spent 9 years telling myself that a duke, burdened as I am, has no business asking anything more of the world than survival for those depending upon him. I begin to think that was never entirely true. I begin to think I simply did not believe,
until you arrived at my door with your blueprints and your stubbornness, that anyone existed who might wish to share the burden rather than merely witness it from a comfortable distance. Vivian felt the warmth of the room, real and hard-won now, settle around them both, and understood that whatever passed between herself and this quiet, careful, endlessly burdened man was no longer a question of professional obligation at all. "The house is warm now," she said softly. "Perhaps it is time its master learned to be the same." He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded and hopeful moving across features that had spent 9 long years perfecting the art of revealing nothing at all. And for the first time since her arrival at Winterspire Keep, Duke Thaddeus allowed himself, quite plainly, to smile. Word of the mended hearthworks spread through Oakhaven Valley faster than any coach could carry it, though not, at Thaddeus's quiet insistence, the whole truth of where the warmth had come from all these years. What the villagers learned instead was simpler and, in its own way, no less remarkable. That the Duke of Winterspire intended to open his gates for the first time in living memory, and that every craftsman and tradesman who had lent their hands to the estate's recent repairs was invited to see the results for themselves. Vivian spent the days before the gathering in a state she did not entirely recognize in herself. Not the brisk, practical focus of an architect closing out a commission, but something softer, tinged with a reluctance to see the work, and the weeks that had come with it draw to their natural end. "You look as though you are already mourning your departure," Thaddeus observed, finding her in the library on the morning of the gathering, where she had gone, ostensibly, to return the old ledger to its proper shelf. "I am considering it, Your Grace. Commissions end. That is the nature of the work." "Some commissions end." He took the ledger from her hands and set it aside, unopened, on the table between them. "Others, I have come to believe, are merely the beginning of something considerably larger than either party first intended." She did not have time to ask what he meant by it, for Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway just then, flustered and pink-cheeked, to announce that the first of the guests had already begun arriving at the gate. The great hall of Winterspire, cold and shuttered for so many years, had been transformed. Fires burned properly in hearths that had stood empty since before Vivian's arrival, and the warmth of it reached every corner of the vast room without strain, without the desperate rationing that had governed every fire in the house since her first evening there. Long tables had been laid with simple, honest fare, and the assembled guests, masons from Ironstone, tradesmen and their families from Oakhaven Valley, the household staff themselves seated as guests rather than servants for the first time anyone could recall, filled the hall with a noise and warmth of their own that the old stone walls seemed almost startled to hold. Halvard had made the journey up from Ironstone himself and greeted Vivienne with a respectful nod before turning to study his host with open curiosity, as though seeing him properly for the first time. "I confess, Your Grace," the old guildmaster said, "you are not entirely the man I was led to expect." "Few people are, Master Halvard, once one troubles to look past what is easiest to believe." Thaddeus's reply held none of the old brittleness Vivienne remembered from her first days at the keep. "I am told I owe a debt of gratitude to your guild's good work these past weeks, and to the woman who convinced you it was worth the lending in the first place." "That you do." Halvard's gaze moved to Vivienne, something like approval settling into his weathered features. "Though I suspect the debt runs a good deal deeper than pipework and valves, if the rumours reaching Ironstone these past days hold any truth to them at all." Thaddeus did not deny it, and neither, Vivian found, did she particularly wish him to. When the meal had passed, and the hall had settled into the easy, contented murmur of a gathering well satisfied, Thaddeus rose from his place at the head of the table, and the room quieted by slow degrees to hear him. "I have not been an easy man to know," he began, and Vivian watched the surprise ripple through the assembled guests at hearing him address them so directly. This duke they had known only by rumour and closed gates for the better part of a decade. "I will not pretend otherwise, nor will I trouble you tonight with the whole history of why that has been so. What I will say is this, that the works beneath this house and beneath your own homes in the valley have needed repair for longer than I ought to have let them go untended,
and that the reason they now stand sound, ready to see every one of us safely through winters to come, is owed almost entirely to one person in this room. He turned and found Vivian's eyes across the crowded hall. Miss Vivian Ashworth arrived at my door some weeks ago as an architect commissioned to assess a failing system. She leaves it, should she choose to stay, as considerably more than that. I have asked her, and she has agreed, to remain at Winterspire as its permanent chief architect, responsible for the continued maintenance of these works and any future improvements this estate or the valley below it may require. A murmur of approval moved through the hall, warm and genuine, though Vivian suspected most of the room understood, from the particular way the Duke's gaze lingered on her as he spoke, that the arrangement being announced was rather more than a simple matter of employment. "But I would be dishonest," Thaddeus continued, his voice steady, despite what Vivian recognized, beneath it, as something closer to nerves than she had ever heard from him before, "if I allowed you to believe her role here begins and ends with pipework and boilers alone. In the weeks since her arrival, Miss Ashworth has become the one person who has looked at the whole of what this house and this family has carried, and chosen to understand it rather than merely judge it from a distance. I do not intend to let that understanding go untended, any more than I intend to let these hearthworks fall back into neglect. I have asked her to remain at Winterspire not merely as its architect, but as my most trusted confidant, in matters both of this estate and, I hope, considerably beyond it." The hall erupted into warmer applause than the announcement of any commission alone could have earned, and Vivian, rising to meet him as he crossed the room toward her, felt the last of the cold she had carried into Winterspire Keep on that first frost-bitten evening finally, completely, thaw away. Outside, the mountain wind still moved cold and constant over Crag Pass, and the boilers deep beneath the house burned steady and true, carrying warmth down through every mended channel to the valley below. But within the great hall of Winterspire, for the first time in longer than anyone present could properly recall, the fire held, and the house was warm, and the Duke, once called the Ice Lord, stood beside the woman who had thawed considerably more of him than merely his estate, in a home no longer frozen and no longer alone.